If you've been paying attention to American politics for the past decade or so, you might have noticed that the majority of our representatives spend very little time and energy actually representing us. Looking at the estimated net worth of politicians like Nancy Pelosi, it becomes clear that the longer you work in politics, the greater your overall wealth. The reporting requirements for politicians only mandate that members report in ballpark figures. So the estimated worth of Nancy Pelosi, for example, ranges from the rising $41 million since 2004 or gaining as much as $115 million since 2008. So even if you go by the lower range estimate, Pelosi's bank account has grown at rates which far exceed those of the average American, even compared to her constituents in San Francisco and Silicon Valley. With so much money in their own coffers, it's interesting that these members of the American aristocracy are always begging for more from voters and billionaire donors alike. You have to wonder why they don't follow Trump's own lead and donate their government salaries instead of enriching themselves at the expense of the American taxpayer. But let's be honest, they aren't in it for us. The data is pretty conclusive that Nancy Pelosi looks after the needs of Nancy Pelosi. Meanwhile, the average American citizen has to deal with smaller wages, higher prices, and fewer jobs. So if most Americans aren't making out like the Capitol swamp bandits, how is it that these same people keep getting reelected? The answer is that DC has perfected a political two-step where politicians run on one set of promises but never deliver. When it comes time to run again, they boldly declare their belief in a certain set of principles and goals, the people reelect them, and the cycle repeats. In other words, these swamp creatures have perfected the art of insulating themselves from the consequences of their actions. As the Trump administration has shown, a healthy understanding of cause and effect does wonders for making the machinery of government actually work for the people it's supposed to serve. But this proved too disruptive for the establishment, so they've spared neither expense nor tactic in finding creative ways in trying to get rid of Trump. They want to go back to the old days where the needs of their constituents were a minor concern dealt with over the course of a handful of months during election season. And you can see the magnitude of this disconnect by the types of candidates they foist on their supporters. You have pro-Palestinian anti-Semites, people who wore blackface or supported Klansmen, people who've slept with known Chinese spies, falsified intelligence for political purposes, and of course the dead guy who got elected in Pennsylvania. One look at this cohort of the Democrat Party's best and brightest, and you immediately understand that anyone crying about candidate quality after the 2022 midterms clearly hasn't seen Fetterman. There are many horrible things that will happen now that so many in government have become untouchable. The establishment has basically cut itself off from reality. And this will only exacerbate scenarios like Ukraine, which has become a funding priority for Biden. Meanwhile, most Americans don't want war. The question then for Americans who see poking the Russian nuclear bear as a bad thing is, what can we do about it? The only recourse in our current situation is to side with the one party with the strongest sense of accountability, and that party is beyond a shadow of a doubt the Republican Party, especially the conservative wing of the party, which is particularly focused on delivering results for their voters, as radical as that concept can be nowadays. And this is not just lip service to the party. You see, most Americans don't have the luxury of living apart from the consequences of their actions. People in the hard studies like physics, math, and engineering, for example, they can't afford the luxury of wishing reality away like your average gender studies major. Also, small business owners have to maintain a keen awareness of anything that might affect their bottom line. And then you have your blue-collar worker, a demographic which once skewed very heavily towards the left has now all but abandoned it. According to one town hall article before the election, a sharp divide has manifested between union leadership on the one hand and the actual union workers. It appears those union leaders have mastered the same trick that their Democrat masters did when it comes to insulating oneself from experiencing the ramifications of their own decisions. So this divide between actual worker and union bosses makes a lot of sense. The two groups have completely different perspectives when it comes to results. As anyone who has worked in an assembly line can tell you, the whole day is one long string of cause and effect. Place the metal sheet into the stamper, and it cuts out the right shape. Do it poorly, and the cut will be in the wrong place, and you've just cost the company however much money it took to get that metal sheet to the stamper in the first place. That's a pretty big consequence. But it could be worse. The assembly line worker could be careless about how they place the sheet and end up shearing off their hand or fingers. Your average blue-collar worker faces these kinds of dire consequences thousands of times a day. Yet when it comes to their union leadership, it's not even a question if the politician they support wants open borders in order to flood the market with cheap labor and suppress wages across the board. Or how about the politicians who get kickbacks for outsourcing jobs to China, all because someone in DC thinks America doesn't need to have an industrial or manufacturing base anymore? Then you have the people who work in energy, another sector of the American economy that the left is hell-bent on destroying. You could accuse them of being self-destructive here. How can you run a country without energy? But the fact is, again, that Democrats have no idea that these policies are what's crippling the economy and raising food prices so much. They also haven't figured out that without blue-collar workers, the entire country would devolve into tribes of hunter-gatherers within weeks. The left has completely forgotten about the blue-collar worker, but we haven't.